Hi everyone, and welcome to From Macro to Micro, the art of fungi photography with Alison Pollack. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. We're glad to see so many of you taking the time to be with us today. In addition to members of Digital Imaging, we have many Royal Photographic Society members and non-members from all over the world. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping points. You'll know to get the best from today's event. While Alison is sharing her screen, you may find that the small thumbnail image of her speaking obscures something important. You can easily move this thumbnail to somewhere more convenient by simply clicking it and dragging it. Secondly, this Zoom event has a special question and answer feature. At the bottom of your screen, or possibly the top if you're using a tablet, you will see a Q&A icon. You can click on this to ask a question at any time during the presentation. At the end of Alison's presentation, there will be time for her to answer your question. Now, we appreciate that her presentation will be so good that you'll immediately want to thank her for it. But please don't. There will be an opportunity for your feedback after the event. So please, for today, questions only. Alison will answer as many of your questions as time. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Alison Pollack. Alison will share some of her high magnification photos of beautiful fungi and slime molds, most so small that you would not see them as you walk through the forest. She will describe how she finds these tiny organisms, most only 1 or 2 millimeters tall, and how she photographs. She will describe her technique for fieldwork as well as studio photography using extreme macro lenses and microscope objectives adapted to her camera. She will discuss all of the gear she uses as well as her methods for shooting and post-processing. Alison is a macro and an extreme macro photographer, specializing in mushrooms and myxomycetes, or slime molds. Her passion is finding and photographing these beautiful organisms, especially the smaller ones, to bring awareness to the beauty that exists right at our feet as we walk through the forest. Her goal is to reveal these miniature beauties of the forest in a format that is much art as it is science. Alison shares her photographs online, where she has amassed a large and enthusiastic following from around the world. Her otherworldly images are captioned with information about her subjects, as well as technical details of her photography process. Alison's photographs have been featured in dozens of print and online publications, including National Geographic, Der Spiegel, Science Weekly, and the New York Sunday Times. And for the past 3 years, her photos have placed in the worldwide Nikon Small World Photography Competition. So, Alison, if you'd like to switch on your camera and microphone, we'll hand over to you for this afternoon's presentation. Welcome, Alison. Over to you.
Hello. I'm going to start and share my screen. All right, I hope everybody can see that now. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to be with you today and to share with you my hobby of mushroom and slime mold photography. I live in Northern California, and I started photographing many years ago, decades ago, as I was hiking. I was and still am an avid hiker, and as I noticed the mushrooms in the woods, I wanted to capture them. Little did I know then that those simple little photographs would turn into quite an obsessive hobby. Today, I'm going to talk about the evolution of my gear, the evolution of my techniques, and my continuing desire to get closer and closer, thus the title of my talk, From Macro to Micro. And of course, I'm also going to show you a number of my photos, which I hope that you'll enjoy. And I also hope that I might inspire some of you after this presentation to go out to your local woodlands and look for and photograph some of these beautiful organisms. Well, it all started with a point and shoot camera. As I said, I was an avid hiker, still am, and I was noticing the mushrooms in the woods, and I wanted to try to capture some of them just because I thought they were pretty. This one, and so I got a point and shoot camera, which at the time was the simple small cameras. This was long before the advent of the cell phone. This, of course, is perhaps the most widely known mushroom in the world, the Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric. I think even every child has seen this mushroom, at least in pictures, if not for real. Very common in our woodlands during our rainy season. This is our most common mushroom in the rainy season. I think it's our most common. The turkey tail has really pretty bands of color, and sometimes they converge in these multiple fruiting bodies at once. I wanted to, excuse me, learn some more about mushrooms but rather than just a few that I knew. So I bought this little book called All That the Rain Promises and More, which is a humorous, delightful, small introduction, but captures all of the common mushrooms in the area that I live. That was a lot of fun. So I still have that book. Of course, I've bought a number of reference books since then, but that's one of my favorites. Eventually, I got an iPhone 6 when I saw how good the iPhone photos were getting, and I took photos of mushrooms with that as I was hiking, and I dropped the point and shoot cameras. This is a waxy cap. It's a very common mushroom, quite common, really brightly colored reds, yellows, oranges, primarily in the middle of the winter for us. And my favorite mushroom iPhone photo is this one. It's technically not a very good quality photo, but what it shows still amazes me. This is a simple shelf fungus or a polypore. And these blue water droplets, it's the actual color, I didn't do any enhancement, is called guttation, or it's basically the mushroom sweating or oozing liquid as it's rapidly growing. And guttation is not uncommon, but it's usually just a clear fluid or a milky fluid or a white fluid. I've never before and have never since seen it blue like this. Well, eventually I decided to graduate to a real camera. So I bought my first DSLR, a Canon 6D, and to take photographs of mushrooms, I got a the Canon 100 millimeter macro lens. I was primarily interested in landscape photography at the time, which is why I bought the DSLR. And so I also had a 16 to 35 millimeter landscape lens, and I did a lot of landscape photography. And also, of course, was photographing mushrooms and other things with the macro lens. The macro lens was quite a challenge for me to learn, but I did eventually figure out how to use it, and I was reasonably happy with the photos that it took. But I was getting unhappy with the landscape photos because the dynamic range of the Canon 6D wasn't very good, the one that I had at the time, and I was doing multiple exposures, 3 exposures for almost all of my landscape photos, and combining them in HDR. So that was time consuming, and I decided to upgrade, and I bought a Sony system because I had read, and it's true, that the dynamic range of the Sony sensors was much, much better, and indeed it was, and I stopped doing any HDR. There was no more need to do that. I bought and still use the Sony A7R2. It's a wonderful camera. I can't even count the number of actuations I have on it now. I've done hundreds of thousands of photos with that camera. And the only lens that I bought for that camera was the Sony 90 millimeter f2.8 macro lens, because at that point I decided, although I was really wanting to do landscape photography, I was much more interested in mushroom photography. So I ditched landscape and switched to mushrooms. I still use this camera. It's a great camera. Some of the photos I took in the field with the Sony camera and the Sony macro lens. This is a baby Samasabi mushroom. It has these almost crystal-like sugary crystals on the gills and the stipe or the stalk. Very pretty, one of my favorite little mushrooms. This was a lucky photo, a lucky find. I was in one of the redwood parks in the East Bay, and I found this in the woods, quite small, maybe an inch or so tall, and I took photos of it. It took me a long time to clean it. It was very dirty. And I posted it online, and I got a couple of responses almost immediately that basically said, "Oh my gosh, do you know what you found?" So I didn't know this at the time, but it is a very rare mushroom. It's actually an endangered mushroom. It's on the endangered list. It's called Hygrocebi flamifolia. I photographed it because I thought the colors were beautiful and the shapes were really pretty. Mushrooms are colorful, and my favorite color for mushrooms is blue, which we don't have very much, but this particular one, which is Chlorosiboria, is indeed this exquisite color of turquoise blue. It gets a little darker as it ages, but it's a really fun find. If you do macro photography, you know that there are definitely some challenges to macro photography. The biggest challenge is that the smaller the subject, the more you magnify, the smaller your depth of field. So it gets tricky to get the entire subject in focus. And even if you use a very narrow aperture, you might not get the entire subject in focus. Well, the solution to that is a digital photography technique called focus stacking, which I'll explain briefly for those of you who might not be familiar with it. But you might ask, why not just take a single photo with a small aperture, the narrowest aperture on your camera? Indeed, a small aperture will show a lot more depth of field, but at higher f-stops, especially at the highest ones, there is some diffraction which can cause softness or blurriness in the photo, which is not what I want. I'm a pixel peeper. I like sharp photos. And the other issue with a narrow aperture, at least it's an issue for me, is it will show not only detail in your subject, your mushroom, but it will also show detail in the background. And my preferred style of photos for mushrooms is to have the background be soft so that the viewer's attention is on the mushroom itself. The goal in my photography is to introduce people to the beauty of mushrooms and slime molds, which I'll talk about, and to hope to inspire people to go out and look for them themselves. So the basics of focus stacking is that you shoot many images where you advance the focal distance ever so slightly between each image. And you do that from the front to the back of your subject so that each part of the subject has at least one image where it's in focus. And there are 3 ways that you can manually focus stack. One is to rotate the focus ring. This is what I did with my Sony and the macro lens for 3 or 4 years. All my focus stacking was done by manually rotating the focus ring. You can also use a focus rail, so the camera and the lens together sits on top of a rail, and you use a little dial or knob to just move that camera on the rail forward 1 step at a time. Another possibility, which I don't recommend, is use the burst mode on your camera. Insect photographers will do this because they have to shoot their subjects very fast, but you have to have really good technique and be able to hold your body very, very still to do that. For insect photography, that's good. For mushroom photography, I don't recommend that. And then lastly, you use computer software that takes all of the individual photos in the stack and creates a composite photo with the in-focus portions of each image. The first time that I did that on my computer, I was totally blown away by what happened. You know, to take that stack of images and create a composite photo was like magic to me. So a little example here. This is not even the highest f-stop on my camera, not at all, but just to give you an example, this is at f9, a little mycena, a young mycena mushroom. It's a nice photo, nice enough, but what I don't like is there's too much detail in the back. Even though it's a little blurry, it's still distracting to me, that background. So I did a much narrower aperture, a wider aperture, f3.5, and I don't remember how many images were in the stack, maybe 20. And I focus stacked it, and now I have a beautifully soft background that is not the least bit distracting, and I still have all of the beautiful detail in the mycelial hairs at the base of the mushroom. I get asked a lot what aperture to use for focus stacking, and that is your choice, what works best for you and what your preferences are. Some people might want to use the sharpest aperture for their lens because they really want the sharpest possible photos they can get. The sharpest aperture is usually referred to as the sweet spot, typically around f8 to f11. If you go to a little wider or a little narrower from there, it's still going to be on most lenses very sharp. The narrower apertures will give you more depth of field in each image, but so you can shoot a smaller number of images in the stack, but there's really no need to do that because disk space is incredibly cheap these days. The computer is very fast at processing the images, so you really don't need to worry about the number of images in your stack. My preference is to use a wide aperture because, as I said, I like the smoother backgrounds so that there's no distraction to looking at the background and the viewer is looking just at the subject of my photo. So I'll talk a little bit about focus stacking software. When I first heard about focus stacking, I already had Lightroom and Photoshop on my computer. So I saw that Photoshop could do focus stacking, so I did some stacks with Photoshop. It has very limited options, and I would say that Photoshop as a stacker is only useful for a short stack meaning a small number of photos. I think that for landscape photographers, it's probably a very good option. So focus stacking is used in landscape photography if, for example, you have a flower right in front of you and some mountains in the background, and you want to try to get the entire field, depth of field in focus. You might take 3, 4, 5 photos at different depths in your field and then combine those in Photoshop. Affinity Photo is an app or a program, I think it's only for Macs, but I'm not sure, that also does focus stacking. But again, I think it's useful only for a short stack because there are very few options for creating the composite photo. There's also some free software that's available for focus stacking. I listed 3 packages here. Most of them are pretty dated. They're not really useful for macro photographers. They don't have enough options. The documentation's not good, or they're not updated. But if you just want to try something for free, you can try one of those 3. Really, the best option, and what I certainly recommend, is to use specialized computer software for focus stacking. And there are 2 packages that are available. Both of them are very good. Helicon Focus, which is from a Ukrainian company, and Zareen Stacker, which is a one-man operation, a fellow named Rick Littlefield in Washington State, here in the United States. Both of these packages have free, fully functional 30-day trial periods. The one caveat here is that in the trial period for Helicon Focus, they put a large watermark in the center of your image, but for Zareen Stacker, everything works and there's no watermark. They both have good retouching tools. Those are sometimes needed because there can be artifacts in focus stacking that you have to fix a little bit with retouching or possibly Photoshop. So some quick notes on advantages of each of them. The biggest advantage of Helicon is its speed. It is way faster than Zareen. It uses the GPU, graphics processing unit, on your graphics card if you have some. All modern computers have that. So it's much faster. It has fewer options, and so it has a much easier learning curve. And if you shoot RAW, as I do, it will convert the RAW files to TIFF without having to do any intermediary process, which you have to do with Zareen. But the Zareen advantages are, in my opinion, it has better depth and color rendition. It has more advanced functionality, which means it has a steeper learning curve. The documentation for Zareen is amazing. It's incredibly in-depth, and there's an online forum where Rick, the developer, answers all questions in vast amounts of detail. And it has very frequent updates. I think the last update for Helicon Focus might have been 2 years ago, and although they are coming out with one soon, they've told me, whereas Zareen Stacker updates probably once every 2 to 3 months, and many of those updates are user requests. One of the best things about Zareen Stacker is the developer support. I have never seen a software package with this much and this good developer support. Anytime I send a question, I get a response back within 24 hours at most. It's usually 2 or 3 hours, and he not only answers my question, but says, oh, by the way, you might want to know this as well, and gives me a lot more information. I use both, I should say. I would suggest, if you want to try stacking, that trying both of them during the 30-day trial period and seeing which one works better. I run everything through Helicon, all of my stacks through Helicon, in part as a screening tool, and also because sometimes the Helicon Focus results are just fine, and that's what I'll use. But many times, if it's a photo that I particularly like, I will run it through Zareen Stacker. As I said, it gets better depth and color rendition, which I really like. So I recommend you try both. Another focus stacking example. This is just the first image in a stack of photos. This is a photo of some mushrooms that I found with a friend in Alaska. I go to Alaska several times a year to visit my friend and go into the woods photographing mushrooms with him. And in here, the first image in the stack, just the very front of the bottom mushroom is in focus, just a tiny, tiny bit. This is a wide aperture, so a narrow depth of field here. And there's the focus stacked photo. Everything is in focus. This maybe had 60 or 70 images in the stack. These mushrooms are probably about a centimeter tall each, maybe a little bit less. Well, I wanted more magnification since I was getting really interested in the smaller mushrooms. So I purchased something called a Raynox 250, which is quite inexpensive. It's less than $100 in the US, and it magnifies about 2.5 times what your lens does. It depends on the lens and a number of other items, but basically it's about a 2.5 times magnifier. And for the price, the quality is amazing. The photos that I got with that camera, with that diopter, are quite good. I used it with my Sony for a long time. Oops. It comes with what they call a universal adapter, which I've shown here at the left. You press on those little protrusions there, and that squeezes springs, and then it attaches to the end of your lens, which is a pretty kludgy way of attaching it to your lens. It also makes the end of the lens wider, and when I'm photographing small things, I usually am going into narrow places. So if you're going to get this, which I definitely recommend as a first step in higher magnification photography, if you already have a 1:1 macro lens, but better to, rather than use this universal adapter, get a step down ring, which is just a simple metal ring that has on one side the filter thread of your camera lens, and on the other side 43 millimeters, which is the filter thread on the back of the Raynox. It's a great little way to start higher magnification. So here are some examples of photos that I took with the Sony and the Raynox. This one is from Colombia. I've taken 2 trips to Colombia, specifically went there to photograph mushrooms. And this one I love because it has what are called marginate gills. The color, the darker orange on the edge of the gills is different than the rest of the color on the gills. And again, the term for that is marginate, and I totally love mushrooms with marginate gills. I do a lot of gill shots in general. This is another one from Colombia. I believe this is a marasmus, but I can't remember. But I took this one because I wanted to show the beautiful, lacy, exquisite patterns in between the gills. Really pretty. And then, as I say, in 2018, I found this and my world changed. I was hiking and all I had was my iPhone. This is an iPhone shot in early 2018, and I saw this on an old decomposing redwood tree, and I had no idea what it was. It was just these little hanging beans, and I'd never seen anything like it before. So I came home, and at 4 o'clock, I turned on my computer, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I turned on my computer, and I did a reverse Google image search to try to figure out what this is, and I quickly learned that it was something called a slime mold, or a myxomycete, which I'd never heard of before. And I started reading and I kept reading and looking for pictures, and I went down the rabbit hole for 12 hours. I didn't move from my desk until 4 in the morning, when I finally said to myself, you have to go to sleep. So I did, but from that moment, I was completely smitten and charmed by slime molds and decided I needed to learn more about them and to look for them and to photograph them. So let me tell you a little bit about slime molds. As I said, the scientific name for them is myxomycetes. It's a long word, and slime mold isn't a particularly appealing name. When I tell people I photograph slime molds, sometimes they kind of do funny faces. So those of us who love them call them myxos for short. That's my favorite term. I actually have a license plate that says I heart myxos. I love myxos. We can personalize our license plates in California. Slime molds aren't animals, although they are locomotive. They move at a certain stage in their lifetime, and I'll show you that. And they're not fungi. They're not mold, although they do propagate with spores, which is and they look a little bit like mushrooms, which was one of the reasons they were originally classified as mushrooms, as fungi. So the term myxomycete is from 2 Greek words, myxo, meaning slime, and mycete, meaning mushroom. But we now know them to be single-celled organisms, and they are now classified in the biological kingdom known as Protista, which includes single-celled amoeba. So, this one that I just showed you that is actually, that whole colony is a term we use, is actually a single cell with many nuclei. So as I said, slime molds are mobile. When you first see them, they start as something called a plasmodium, which is slimy, sticky. And I don't have a video here, but this plasmodium moves, it progresses along its substrate, its wood or leaves or plants, searching for food to eat. It usually eats yeast and algae and bacteria, sometimes fungi. And there's another example of plasmodium. This was actually my favorite plasmodium shot. It was in a redwood park, and it's the inside of an acorn, which I thought was really pretty. So eventually, the plasmodium stops looking for food, and the fruiting bodies start to come forward. It could be it's run out of food, or it could be environmental conditions are changing, or whatever. But in this photo here, you can just barely see some of these round things starting to form from the plasmodium. Here's a better example. This one's actually from Colombia, where you can clearly see the fruiting bodies starting to form, these little egg-like clumps of eggs. And there's bits of the plasmodium left on the leaf, but eventually all of the plasmodium disappears, and all of those cells go up to, all of that goes, the parts of the plasmodium go up into forming the fruiting bodies, and you no longer even see the plasmodium. Sometimes you see tracks, but you don't see the plasmodium once the fruiting bodies are there. Immature slime molds are often white, and they're fun to see, especially when they're on the edges of leaves, or mature slime molds, but I really love to find these things on the edges of leaves. Some slime molds feed on fungi in addition to bacteria, yeast, and algae. This particular one is the only one that hangs from these long threads like this. It's quite colorful, which I'll show you in a bit. And on the other hand, some fungi feed on slime molds. Just a mouthful here. The fungus is Polycephalomyces tomentosus, and the slime mold is called Trichiobotrytis. In my opinion, slime molds are beautiful, and they're quite colorful. This was one of the first ones I photographed in my local woods, Point Reyes National Seashore, which I live quite close to. And this is a slime mold where the outer layer has opened up to reveal what are called the capillidial threads within, similar to this one, which is an Arceria species that I found in Alaska. So those thread-like things are called the capillidium, and they hold the spores. If you zoomed way, way, way in, you'd be able to see the spores. And as it dries out more and more, the wind disperses those spores, or animals brush against them, or something brushes against them, and the spores are released to start the life cycle all over. This is one I found in Alaska that I was really delighted to see. It's called Wilcomlangia reticulata, very colorful with these red dots in the middle of it. And slime molds do come in every color of the rainbow. This one is a Cribraria species that is blue only for a portion of its life cycle. It's very quick, and I was really delighted to find it in that blue stage. I've only seen it maybe once since then. Another very colorful one. This is a Physarum species. I'm not quite sure yet because it's not fully mature, but it's sort of Christmas-like colors to me. And it's growing on moss. So there's little tiny bits of moss. So you can see how very tiny the slime molds are. This is one of my favorite photos. I call this one the Lemmings to the Sea. Another one from Alaska. Really pretty, lined up on the edge of, this is actually decomposing wood, although a lot of people don't think it is, but it is actually very highly decomposed wood. Really, just for some reason, I love this photo. So one really important thing to know about slime molds when you're looking for them is that they are very, very tiny. When I post slime molds, I try to remember always to post some sort of a scale photo. Sometimes I get too excited in what I'm doing and I forget, but I want to post a scale photo so people get an idea of how small they really are. So the photo on the left is taken with a microscope objective, and the photo on the right, the green arrow is pointing to the pair. This is a didymium species, pointing to that pair of didymium on the edge of the leaf. Very tiny. Another example, one of my favorite examples, this one looks like sort of a flaky almonds on top of a bakery treat. Quite small. I then zoomed back and took a photo of a whole little forest of these slime molds. It's also on some decomposing wood. I actually didn't find this one. A researcher sent this one to me because I really wanted to see this species. And then I took my scale photo of a pencil. So you can see, excuse me, that a single fruiting body is just about the size of the tip of a pencil. And as I like to joke, it's not a giant pencil. Almost all slime molds change colors as they go through their life cycle. And this is the same plasmodium I showed you before. So this particular one, when it starts to fruit, the fruits, the immature fruiting bodies are this gorgeous yellow-orange, and they dangle from these threads. Usually these are on the sides or underneath big logs, sometimes on a mushroom. And after the orange, it turns into sort of a buff tan color, and then it turns into almost black or a very, very dark gray, and ultimately to really pretty iridescent blues and purples. Badhamia utricularis is the name of this one. So this one changes colors 3, 4, 5 times, and in the space of maybe 2 days, maybe 2 weeks. The life cycle of most slime molds is about that range. Well, of course, I wanted more magnification because I'm looking at these tiny fruiting bodies and I want to be able to see the detail. And I'd heard about this Laowa 2.5 to 5x lens that was announced, I think, in 2017. And I bought it as soon as I could, which I think was 2018, maybe 19. And I started using this not in the field, but in my home studio. It is an excellent build, mostly metal. Really good image quality, very, very sharp in the full range of magnification. It is only a manual focus lens, so you have to have a focus rail to be able to use it. Well, I have to have a focus rail, I suppose. If you have really terrific properties, abilities, you can move your body, but it would be very hard. So I highly recommended to use a rail. The working distance of this lens is very good for macro photography. Working distance refers to the distance between the end of the lens and your subject. And in this case, it's about 40 to 45 millimeters, or for those of us in the US, about 1.5 inches, which is plenty of room to get some light in there, either flash or LED lights. And then, as I said, you have to best to use it with a focus rail. I should add that although I don't have it, Laowa has an excellent 2x lens, 2x macro lens, which a friend of mine has, who's an extremely good macro photographer, and he says it is the sharpest lens that he has. It also is manual focus only, so you need to use a focus rail with it to do macro photography. And it focuses to infinity, which means that you can use it not just for a macro lens, but also for a portrait lens or other kinds of photography. This is a rail developed by a German company called Novaflex. They do exquisite precision engineering. Novaflex kindly sent me this rail several months ago, and I used it for a while. It's a really beautiful rail. I think it was actually made for the Laowa 2.5 to 5x or other macro lenses like the Canon MPE 65, which goes from 1x to 5x. So it has very fine precision movements as you rotate that knob at the end, and then the entire camera plus lens moves forward on that rail. So one rotation of that wheel is only 0.8 millimeters. It's very, very small, and it has markings on it, so you can do precise movements of the camera for focus stacking. And it has something called a click stop. So you rotate the wheel. If you set the click stop to anything between some 1, 2, 3, 4, 5x, it will click at the appropriate step size for that magnification. So if you want to use the Laowa 2.5 to 5x in the field, I highly recommend this rail. At home, I use the Laowa and other high magnification lenses with an electronic automated focus rail. And the one I use is what I think was the very first focus rail that came to the market for consumers, made by a company in Canada called Cognisys, and it is called the Stack Shot. This is what I'm still using today. It's a little dated in its technology, as you can see on the right side on the control box, but it works great. I've been very happy with it. So here is, in fact, the Laowa 2.5 to 5x on my Sony, sitting on top of the Stack Shot rail. You see the controller at the bottom right. In this case, I have the Stack Shot mounted on top of my old Kirk ball head, which is on a double Arca-Swiss plate that attaches the ball head to a long Arca-Swiss rail. The reason I do this is because I have a number of different high magnification lenses that require a wide range of distances between the camera and the subject. So I want to be able to move the entire mechanism quite a bit. The Laowa lens here is shown extended at its highest magnification, which is 5x. I have used this lens for years and I really love it. A lot of my photographs have been taken with this setup. Some examples of slime molds or mixos that I took with that Laowa. This is a Cribraria species. It's been dried out. Oh, I forgot to say that one of the many terrific things about slime molds is, in addition to the fact that they're beautiful and they're colorful, is that once they're dried out, they will retain their shape, their structure, their texture, their colors virtually indefinitely. So I can collect them in the woods. If they're wet, I can take them home and let them dry at home. Or if they're dry in the woods, I can carefully package them and take them home. And as long as I don't touch them or keep them away from moisture, they will stay exactly as they are for a very long time. So I don't have to worry about rushing home to photograph them. I've actually been sent a specimen that was 100 years old that I photographed, and it still had its beautiful original colors. This is one of my favorite early slime mold photos. It's an unusual one for my area. It's found more in the mountains. It's called Prototrichia. And I was amazed when I looked through. I couldn't see this in the field, but when I shot it at home with a Laowa, to see the capillidium, the inside of the fruiting body here with these branching threads. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I was totally amazed by it. Okay, I then learned that there are some cameras out there that do in-camera focus stacking. So modern DSLR and mirrorless cameras can do this with autofocus lenses. And the camera takes all the images at the series of focal lengths. You tell it where to start, where to end, what the step size is. And with these cameras, there are two options to create the composite photo. The easiest one is that the camera will take a number of images and it will do the compositing in the camera and create the composite image. And that technically is called focus stacking. That's usually limited to a smaller number of images in the stack. The other way that it's done, which I do, is that you take the whole series of images, hundreds potentially, with the camera, and then you export the images and you composite them on your computer using either Helicon or Zerine or whatever focus stacking software you want to use. So now all of the major camera manufacturers have focus stacking in some of their cameras, the high-end cameras. Olympus, which is what I use now, performs extremely well. The lenses are sharp and it has really good macro lenses, and it recently came out with a 2x macro lens. Another common series is the Nikon Z series. I don't like that one only because when it's doing focus stacking, the screen goes dark and I want to be able to see my images when I'm shooting the stack. Finally, Sony, I waited and waited and waited for 3 years for Sony to come out with focus stacking. They finally did, I think a year ago in the A7R5, maybe in another one since then, but the screen blinks while it's doing, it goes black photo while it's shooting the stack, which wouldn't work for me. And then I think that Canon and Fuji mirrorless cameras, the screen stays on when stacking, though I haven't used them. This is my current kit for field photography. After waiting for Sony, excuse me, for 3 years, I finally bought an Olympus EM1 Mark III, which was the best Olympus at the time that did focus stacking. I still use it in the field. I'm very happy with it. I originally started with a 60mm Olympus lens and the Raynox and some extension tubes. And then early this year, Olympus came out with a 90mm 2x macro lens. It is autofocus. So it is the first lens on the market that is magnification greater than 1:1 that has autofocus, which means that you can use the in-camera focus stacking. I also bought an Olympus 2x teleconverter, which means between that and the lens, I'm getting 4x with my camera, and I love this combination. So for mushrooms, maybe I might only use the 2x lens, but when I'm photographing slime molds and I want to zoom in on just a small number of fruiting bodies, I use the teleconverter. I started with a Manfrotto tripod, which was big and heavy for landscape photography. I needed something heavy, but last year, I think I switched to a much lighter, slick tripod. It has a center post, which I took off to make it go much flatter, because mushrooms are mostly, and slime molds are mostly close to the ground. And I also bought a lightweight Chinese ball head Sirui K30X to replace my much heavier 3-pound Kirk ball head. All right, so let me talk a little bit about my process for setting up and taking photos in the field. I spend a lot of time preparing the scene, much more time than I take actually shooting the photos. So I want to make the subject as clean as possible and the background as clean as possible. I carry some tiny paintbrushes that I got at the local art supply store, and I use that to brush off bits of dirt and other detritus from the subjects. My friend Tim calls this mushroom custodial duties, which I like. And I clean the background. So cleaning the background means I don't want any distracting elements in the background, even though I'm using a wide aperture. You can still see like a blade of grass will show up as almost not a line, but a blurry line in the background, which I find distracting. So I use tweezers to move things away from the subject and away from the background. I use manual exposure, fixed manual exposure for everything. So I set that and I check that with single shots. I almost always use just natural light, which I far prefer. If I'm using natural light and I need a high, a slow shutter speed, that's not a problem. I'm on a tripod. The mushrooms and slime molds don't move. So that's what I typically do. Shutter speeds of half a second or even a second in a stack for me are not uncommon, but sometimes it's just end of the day, especially it's just too dark. And so I will add some artificial light, and I carry with me a couple of low-level LED light panels. So once I have all my exposure and lighting set, then I set the starting point for the stack in my camera. I set the number of images and I shoot the stack. I don't set the end point. I just set the start and the number, and a high number of images. That's actually set to, I don't know, maybe 300 in my camera, but I never take that many in the woods, for almost never, for a single stack. I just watch it in the viewfinder or in the LCD screen, and when it's gotten through the stack and everything I want has some image in focus, then I just press the shutter button to stop the stacking. I should add here that if you have custom buttons on your camera, which most cameras do these days that have focus stacking, I highly recommend programming one of those custom buttons for your focus bracketing. I actually have 2 of them. They're for 2 different f-stops for focus bracketing, and I have another one that does aperture priority, which is what I use for checking the manual exposure. So I easily just go back and forth between these 2 custom modes on my camera, and it's much faster than going through the whole menu system to find and set up your focus bracketing. So some examples using the Olympus and the 90mm macro lens, and in this case, the 2x teleconverter. I bought this, the lens and the teleconverter in March of this year, and I got it 2 days before I left for Colombia. I was concerned about all the everything and the moisture, the condensation, especially I was concerned about in Colombia. So I left the 2x teleconverter on the camera with the 2x lens the entire time I was in Colombia. This is a cute little tiny mycena from Colombia, and there you can see how small it is. with the 90mm and the 2x, I have to pull much farther back from the subject. It took a little getting used to, but it takes beautiful photos. This one's from Alaska. I think this is a Phaeomarasmius. I love mushrooms that I find that have roughly feathery stalks and caps. So I really like this mushroom. You may notice that I often shoot mushrooms from the underside. The underside is usually much more interesting to me than the cap of the mushroom. And I love gill patterns. Another tiny one, not as tiny as some of the things I photograph, but still pretty small. This one is from northern Wisconsin. I taught a 5-day mushroom photography class there this summer. A really pretty mushroom called Xeromphalina. It has a black background. So when I'm in the woods, I try different backgrounds. Sometimes I'll start just looking at whatever happens where the mushroom is. Sometimes I put moss behind. Sometimes I put a green leaf behind, and sometimes I put a piece of black velvet behind, which will really bring forth the colors of the mushrooms. I will often try a couple of different backgrounds, but in this one, I really liked the mushrooms against the dark background. I love gill patterns. This one is back at home near San Francisco in the watershed, and this is another Samasabi mushroom that when it dries, the gills turn from straight to these beautiful curly wavy patterns. I just love the patterns of the gills in this one. This one is from Colombia, and I just jumped and excited, just shouted, wow, when I saw this one. I'd never seen a mushroom like this before. I think it's called Glowiocephala, something like that. And those little protrusions on the outside are called cystidia. Really cool little mushroom. Very tiny. So it was on a leaf, and each one of those white dots is one of these mushrooms. This is back in Point Reyes in my local woods here. It's a young split gill mushroom, very common around the world. But when it's young like this and just starting, it has these, that's the cap is very frilly, but it just looks like a petulant teenager to me. Is what I think of when I see this photo. Another gill shot, but also showing the cap. I think this one is Flammulaster, but I'm not sure. Growing on lichen on a branch in Alaska. I just love the gills and the texture of the stipe on this one. It's a little fuzzier, furrier, but it was raining, so the water has matted it down a little bit. Another one from Colombia. Really pretty one. I love the intricate laciness of the gills. Just gorgeous. And a baby one with the grown-up one. And a few slime molds taken with my Olympus gear. This is a Cribraria species. I found it inside a log. It was wet, it was dewy, so I turned it over and photographed it and really liked the composition here. This is our Syria species. There are several that are red. And again, we're seeing it. It's the fruiting body has opened up on top, and you're seeing the capiloidal threads which are holding the spores. It's just a really pretty mushroom. Sorry, slime mold. This is one I found in Alaska. If you remember the one before that I said looked like almonds on a bakery item, this is a young version of that. I was astonished to find it in Alaska. I don't think it had been found before in Alaska. I was really excited, took tons of photos of it. So an amazing slime mold. Well, of course, I wanted even more magnification to be able to get more and more of the details. I had read about using microscope objectives to photograph mostly bugs, critters, some amazing photos, extreme macro photos using microscope objectives of various kinds of bugs, and to show astonishing detail. So I never thought I would do it when I first read about it, but ultimately I did. I bought this one, which is a Japanese company called Mirutoyo. It's a 10x microscope objective, which is easily adapted to a camera. I'll show you that in a minute. If you want to get into macro photography using microscope objectives, Mirutoyo is definitely the best one. They are expensive, but it is the sharpest. Nikon also makes one that's pretty good. The Mirutoyos are known for their this particular line of objectives is made for long working distance. So if you think of a microscope, the objectives are usually almost sitting right on top of the slides, which is no good for macro photography because you need to get light in there. So it has a working distance of 33.5 millimeters, which is plenty enough to get some light on your subject. You need to be able to use this with what's called a tube, a 200 millimeter tube lens. Basically, you need 200 millimeters between the sensor and the objective, and there are various ways to do that. This is what I am currently doing. At first, I was starting with literally a hollow tube, but now I use a Nikon 200 millimeter lens, that a f4 macro lens that a friend had and was no longer using, so he gave it to me, and it's great for this purpose. At the end of the Nikon lens, I have a small adapter, just a ring adapter that goes from the filter thread on the end of the Nikon lens to the thread on the back of the objective. And then at the left side there, you see the microscope objective. I've got the end covered with a bit of black paper that I use just to block some reflections. Here I'm showing it on the stack shot on the Kirk ball head. That's what I had set up at the time, but these days I mostly use it without the ball head to make it more stable. When you do high magnification photography, you're very sensitive to vibrations, all kinds of vibrations. If you live in the city, a truck driving by on the street. So you want to make the system as absolutely stable as possible. Some people put them on extremely heavy tables and use weights. And then ultimately, I wanted to get even more magnification. So insane as I am, I recently got a used 20x mid-Toyo objective, which is a lot harder to use than the 10x. I'm not quite happy with the photos yet, but they're getting better, and I will soon start showing photos with that objective. Novaflex, the German company that I mentioned a while ago that does beautifully precision engineered products for photography and macro photography. They have very recently come out with a rail, an automated rail for extreme macro photography called the Castell Micro Rail. Novaflex has kindly sent me one of these rails. I just got the last piece. I needed to use it yesterday. I haven't tried it, but I know some folks who use this rail and say it is the best rail on the market, and I'm really excited to try it. You can also, because it's light, and at home I'll use it with electricity, but in the field you can use it with Canon camera batteries. So you can take it out into the field and use it for macro photography or extreme macro photography in the field. This image comes from Robert Thompson, who's an Irish photographer. My studio process for using the Laowa and the microscope objectives is fairly similar, but I'll tell you the steps here. The most important thing I do now, I didn't do at the beginning, was that I have a stereo microscope, and I use that, I look through that to pick the fruiting bodies I want to photograph and the angle I want to photograph them at. I didn't do that at first, and I ended up with a lot of stacks that after taking all the photos and probably hours to do all the shooting and the compositing, I would see that there was a dirt or a flaw somehow in the fruiting body, and I really wanted to pick as perfect fruiting bodies as I could. So I bought a basic stereo microscope, and I used that. I use various tools. When I say to set up the shots, I mean to line up the subject into the viewfinder. And when you're doing that at 10x or 20x, it can actually be quite challenging. There are ways to do it. I use rails. I use lab jacks that move up and down. I use helping hands that are used in soldering. I use various things to get the subject where I want it to be, but it can be quite challenging. The lighting, I definitely use artificial lighting, always use artificial lighting when I'm doing extreme macro. For the Laowa, I have used almost exclusively 3 LED light panels. And with the 20x, the shutter speeds need to be shorter in terms of avoiding vibrations. So I'm switching to flash for the 20x objective. And I also use, I've made a number of DIY do-it-yourself diffusers. Anybody who does extreme macro almost always makes their own diffusers with all kinds of possibilities. Juice boxes, milk boxes, parts of lamps, tracing paper. I have a variety of DIY diffusers, and those are important, especially for slime molds that have iridescence, because otherwise you can get hot spots. As in the field, I set and check my manual exposure settings with the stack shot, and also with the NovaFlex, you would set your starting and ending points for the stack and the step size. And there are tables and programs online that you can use to calculate the steps, the best step size. So this is one of the slime molds I photographed with the 10x objective, and even then the photo is cropped. It's very, very tiny. This one has amazingly beautiful blue and purple iridescence. A lot of slime molds have iridescence, and of all colors of the rainbow, and I love the iridescence. It's one of my favorite parts of slime molds. This particular Physarum species rarely has this much iridescence, so it was really fun to see that much. And it is, as usual, very tiny. A friend of mine found these in the woods on this piece of decomposing wood, and the red arrow is pointing to the little tiny pair that I photographed with the microscope objective. This is one of my favorites. It's certainly my favorite genus, called Lamproderma. Almost all of them have these gorgeous iridescent colors, and this one I like in particular because it has all these ridges. I don't think this is a natural part of the life cycle, but from my observation, what I think is happening is I found this in the woods when it was immature and still forming, and I took it home and it dried too fast. And so I think that's what created all the crinkles, but I think the crinkles are gorgeous. And I also love the webbing that is growing between the two stalks that occasionally happens, and it's always, excuse me, always pretty when it does. And this is a very, very tiny slime mold that a researcher sent me for photographing for a paper he was writing. It's like almost like a little gilded cage around the spore ball there. This is only, I think it's 0.5 millimeter tall, so really tiny. The same researcher sent me these. These are from the Philippines, Physarum roseum. Slime molds come in every color, and this is the only slime mold that I'm aware of that has this vibrant pink color. Another one of my favorites, this is an immature Didymium clavis, and the stalk, the stem with that texture, I've never seen anything like this before. I've still never seen anything like it. It might be just compressed. I found it in the alley of a friend's backyard, and the little crystals on top, I don't know what they are. I've never seen them before or since. And I've asked world experts and researchers, and they don't know what it is, but it's just makes for a cool shot. Post-processing. That's an evil word to some people. I happen to love post-processing. Before I retired, I did a lot of computer work. I love computers. I love working with computers. I love nature. I love photography. So this whole extreme macro focus stacking is perfect for me. So I do enjoy the process of post-processing. And however, I still want to do as much as I can in the field so that I have a minimal amount of post-processing. In particular, I want to clean as much as I can in the field. I use Lightroom and Photoshop extensively. I use Lightroom, which I love primarily because of the database. I have a bad memory these days, so I can find any photo usually in 5 seconds that I've ever taken because I use keywords a lot in Lightroom. Anyway, for my post-processing, I use Lightroom. I make minor changes such as global or local exposure adjustments. It has masking these days, which is great for some local exposure adjustments. I almost always do highlight and shadow adjustments, bring down the highlights and bring up the shadows a bit. And sometimes I will apply some texture and or clarity and or dehaze. I go to Photoshop maybe a third of the time after processing the photos in Lightroom, and in Photoshop, if there are spots I was unable to remove in the field, I will remove those. Yes, it's not exactly what I saw in nature, but my goal is to show people the beauty of these organisms, and so I don't want them to be distracted by spots. Sometimes stacking can have artifacts, which is a whole lecture in and of itself. And sometimes you have to go into Photoshop to remove those artifacts. Sometimes you can remove them with changing the parameters of stacking, much better done in Zarine than Helicon. And if I want to add some sharpening, I will use the Unsharp mask in Photoshop, or I use Topaz Sharpen AI. So if you want to go look for slime molds and fungi, you might want to know where to find them. Most people know that fungi need moisture. They grow after the rains, and the same is true of slime molds or mixos. So they need moisture to develop and mature. Here where I live in Northern California, we have a very brief rainy season, getting briefer and briefer with climate change. So we only have maybe 2 to 3 months of rain. So it's a short season for looking for mushrooms, and my slime mold's my favorite subject. But you guys in the UK, you have a lot of rain. So you should be able to find slime molds year round. Where to find them? Forests, parks, your garden. If it's watered, wood piles are a good source. Leaf litter after rains, just pick up leaves one at a time in the leaf litter, and you will often find slime molds in between layers of leaves. If you know what iNaturalist is, which is a citizen science website and application for phones, you can use that to look when and where things are fruiting. I use iNaturalist a lot for my area. It's very popular, and I want to know if I want to find a particular kind of a mushroom, I can see where it's been found and then go to that place and try to find it myself. Mushrooms are easy to find, but smaller mushrooms and mixos are harder because they're so small. I use that little tool that you're seeing me use in the picture I'm showing in the bottom left. Is a 10x LED magnifying lens. A lot of people use a small jeweler's loop that they can hang around their neck, but I find this one with the light much better for me. So you want to go look for these things in wet forests or parks. Decomposing logs, look on the sides of logs, look underneath logs and branches. Look on woody debris, just bits of wood on the forest floor, and leaf litter. So I pick up a lot of branches, I look at them, I gently put them back where they were, but they're very, very small. The mixos are mostly between 1 and 3 millimeters tall. The vast majority of the ones that I photograph are like 1 to 2 millimeters tall, so you have to look slowly and carefully. And most people, when they start looking for slime molds, get frustrated because they don't realize how small they are. So just look slowly. I've mostly shown you photos of individual slime molds, but in fact, many of them are actually in clusters. We call them colonies. So you're not necessarily looking for a single slime mold, but a group of slime molds, which is much easier to find. If I'm walking through the forest, I'm walking slowly, and I'm looking for bits of color that are different from the surroundings. And then I get down on my hands and knees, and I take out my magnifying lens and look. I spend a lot of time in the forest on my hands and knees. So for me, another place I can find slime molds is in spring snowmelt in the mountains. You probably don't have tall enough mountains in the UK, but you can certainly find snowmelt fungi and slime molds in the spring, in the Alps, in the rest of Europe, and also in Scandinavia, all the countries of Scandinavia. There are about 1,000 species of slime mold around the world, maybe 1,100, and about 100 of them grow only in snowmelt areas. And for that to happen, you need to have snow cover for at least 3 months, a heavy snowpack. And then in the spring, the infrared radiation from the sun penetrates the snow and warms up the soil and that little tiny air gap between the snowbank and the ground. And that is the conditions for the mixos to start growing. And as the snow melts and the snowbank recedes, you can find slime molds right at the edge of the melting snow or near the edges of the melting snow. So I can go usually for 2, maybe even 3 months to the mountains at higher and higher elevations as the temperatures warm up, and find a lot of snowmelt slime molds and fungi. And some of my favorites, my favorite snowmelt mushroom is this one, which is a chromacera. This beautiful pinks, yellows, lilac colors, really pretty mushroom. Also in the snowmelt areas, you find a lot of tiny cup fungi. That's what these are, like ascomycetes. This particular one is Lachnelula. They're quite tiny, but they're always in clusters. And these are common in this, also in Europe, in snowmelt areas, and as well other brightly colored tiny cup fungi, which are really pretty to photograph. And snowmelt, a few snowmelt mixo examples. Lamproderma, as I mentioned, is my favorite genus. There are about 25 of them that grow only in snowmelt, just amazingly beautiful, tiny slime molds, usually about a millimeter to 1.5 millimeters tall. This one is Lamproderma arceriolnema, which has these tiny white needle-like crystals, really pretty, beautiful iridescent colors. Another species of Lamproderma, I don't know the species yet, I need to do microscopy, but just slightly different. Usually they're round, they're more regular shapes, but these were kind of fun because they were slightly odd shapes and gorgeous colors. How can you not fall in love with that? And you can find mixos in the tropics. As I mentioned, I've been to Colombia twice. The first time I wasn't so interested in mixos, but the second time I was hoping to find 2 species in particular that grow only in the tropics, and I found both. This is the first one, and those little sort of threads with little tiny lollipops around the edge, those are actually the spores on little threads for this particular species. A really, really pretty one. Again, we're talking here, this one's probably 2 millimeters tall. And the other tropical one, same genus, but different species. This is called Ceratiomyxa morchella. Morchella, which is the name for morel mushrooms, because it sort of has the texture, the shape of a morel mushroom, but a beautiful glassy, this just looks like a glass sculpture to me. Really amazing. I took this, focus stacked this with the Olympus and the 2x teleconverter in the field. And before I end, I just want to give a little tiny plug. I mentioned that I did a 5-day mushroom photography class in Wisconsin at an art school called Madeline Art School in September. I will be doing that class again next September if you happen to be in the United States or know somebody who will be there, doing it with Christian Schwartz, a very well-known mycologist who has written several field guides for mushrooms. I'm going to end just with a couple of my very favorite photos. This is one I found in Golden Gate Park, excuse me, in the middle of San Francisco. It is 2 completely different genera of slime molds, one growing on top of the other. It is quite rare to find something like this, not impossible. I've seen it now, I think 3 times, and always a delight. Those are Lamproderma, the little, it's like a cheerleader with pom-poms here. Just I always giggle when I see this one. And I'm going to end here with my very favorite photo of all time, yet another Lamproderma with the crinkly texture. It actually was on the same leaf as the other one I showed you with the crinkly texture. If you want to see my photographs online, you can follow me on either Instagram or Facebook. My accounts or names are on the slide here. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. It's been delightful, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Alison. That was fascinating. If you'd like to turn off your screen sharing now so we can see you again, please, for the Q&A.
I will do that.
That's lovely. Thank
Okay.
you. As I said, fascinating subject, amazing pictures.
Thank you.
Anyway, now is the time for you to ask Alison your questions. We've already got 14 lined up, but if you can think of any more, please put them onto the screen. You can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, or as I said, maybe at the top if you're using a tablet. As I also mentioned, if you want to comment on today's event or send your thanks, please could you say that for the survey, or we'll send you in a few days' time. So for today, questions only, please. So the first question is from Hector. Which computer do you use with focus stacking software?
I have a PC. I've used a PC for a long time. Macs are also quite popular. My personal opinion is you get more bang for your buck with a PC. If you're doing focus stacking, especially high magnification focus stacking, when I'm in the field, I might get 20 to 100 photos or 150 for a stack. But when I use microscope objectives, I get anything from 100 to 600, 700, 800 photos in a stack. So you need a lot of RAM, a pretty high-powered computer, and GPU. So when I bought a microscope objective, I bought a new computer. I have now 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is plenty. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Question from Rex. Slime molds move. How do you cope with focus stacking if they move?
Okay, they only, perhaps I didn't clarify this. I showed you the plasmodium as they're creeping along the log. That is when they're moving. But once the fruiting bodies arise from that plasmodium, they don't move. They might move if there's a strong wind. I don't do focus stacking if there's a strong wind, or I use something to block the wind. But most of the time they don't move, so focus stacking is easily accomplished.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good question.
Question from Roger. Where do you start focusing for a stack, and which aperture do you use?
Okay, good question. I first started focusing for a stack. I would look through not the viewfinder, but the screen on the back of my camera and get the front of my subject, let's say a mushroom, the front of the mushroom in focus. And I learned the hard way by taking those stacks home and finding that I actually missed something in the very front. So now what I do is I find what I think is the frontmost portion of my subject, and I pull back some so that nothing is in focus. Everything is a little bit blurry. So I have extra shots at the beginning. At the same time I do the stack, then I make sure that I have extra shots at the end. I might have 10 or 20 or even 50 if it's high magnification, extra photos, but that's not a problem. I just get rid of them and I don't use them in the stacking. For aperture, I prefer the wide aperture in most of my photos because I want a nice, soft, blurry background. So I'm typically shooting 2.8 to 3.5 in that range.
Thank you very much. Question from Philip. I've got a couple of questions from Philip. But the first one is, Alison, could I ask, have you tried the OM 90mm macro lens on bellows rather than the 2x converter to gain magnification? So less glass elements to go through. He's asking this because he has the NovoFlex OM dedicated bellows.
Yeah, I haven't tried it. I don't have any bellows are actually quite commonly used with microscope objectives, and I don't have it for that either. So I can't say how it works.
Okay, well, that's actually a point he raises a bit later on. He says, Alison, I have a bellows, so could I use that to gain the 200mm for using a microscope objective?
You can use the bellows with a microscope objective, but if you're using a type of objective that I use, you need something to focus through. So usually what people use is a Raynox 150. Also something from Thor Labs called an ITL 200 or something else. There's a website in the UK, I think it's called extreme-macro.co.uk. It is a terrific website. It is the best website, I think, to start with if you want to learn how to use microscope objectives, and they talk about everything that you can use, including bellows. I would suggest starting to look there.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Again, a question from Philip. Alison, do you have a picture of your lighting setup at home?
Do I have a picture of my lighting setup at home? Probably not. I tell you what I use for the Lauer 2.5 to 5x, which I'm mostly using at 5x. I use 3 Trond, TROND LED light panels, and I angle them, 2 of them on the side and sometimes 1 on top. And as I said, I use various kinds of diffusion, but I don't think I have a picture that I can show you.
Very much. Question from Vathani. Could we kill a tiny mushroom or mycete by moving the decomposing bark or leaf it's growing from?
By moving I didn't hear the rest of it.
Sorry, could we kill a tiny mushroom or mycete by moving the decomposing bark or leaf it is growing from?
Could you kill it?
By moving what it's growing on.
Okay, let's talk about a mushroom first. So think of a mushroom is the fruiting body. So think of a mushroom like an apple tree. If you pick an apple from a tree, the apple is the fruiting body of the tree, and the mushroom is the fruiting body. Most of the mushroom is underground in what's called the mycelium, which is where the mushrooms start to grow. So if you pick a mushroom in the woods, you're not actually killing the mushroom. You're taking off that fruiting body as you're taking the apple off the tree, but mushrooms will continue to grow. With slime molds, are you killing it? I suppose it's a little different there. It's drying out. And yes, you're taking the spores with you if you take it home. And so that particular one isn't going to propagate anymore. But if there was that one, there are probably millions of other spores in the very same area that will propagate further.
Okay. Question from Surab. There are many one-to-one lenses which varies in focal length, e.g. from 35mm to 100mm. Which ones would be better?
I didn't hear the first one. Many what kinds of
There are
lenses?
many one-to-one lenses or macro lenses,
Okay.
which vary in focal length from, say, 35 to 100 mil. Which will be better, and are there pros and cons to each type?
Well, I think it's a matter of personal preference. So I've seen, for example, with Olympus and other cameras, macro lenses in the 35mm range, you're getting a wider angle. So that's good for larger mushrooms. And also if you want to show a little bit more of the scene, what's behind the mushroom. So my preference is to use the longer lenses, which allow me to get closer and give more detail on the mushroom or the slime mold itself, but don't show you what's in the background. So I think it's a matter of personal preference and style.
Okay, another question from Philip. Alison, what lighting do you use out in the field to photograph slime mold?
Most of the time, none. I really prefer daylight, natural light. I try to angle myself or the camera so that either I have light. Sometimes I use a reflector, just a simple white card to bounce some light onto the slime mold, but I rarely use any. If I have to, I use 2 small LED panels. There's a little panels, a Chinese company called Ulanzi, Ulanzi, and they make these small wands that are about this big. I don't have one here to show you. And I use those in the field. But you have to be careful with slime molds, especially when they're fresh. They can be shiny if they're wet. They can be wet or iridescent. They can be shiny, and then the lights will show in the slime molds. So you probably need to either put the light very far away or use some diffusion. So because of those issues, I tend really to very, very rarely use LED lights. Yeah, I never carry flash, just to complete that. I never use flash in the field.
Okay. A question from Jan. Alison mentioned light panels. They would value more information on those panels if you have some.
I think I just gave that.
You just gave some information,
Yeah. Well, the 2, I gave some. So the ones I use in the studio are Trond, Trond. There are also a company called Godox that makes very, very good light panels that a lot of extreme macro photographers use. There's something called a Godox 64. And the Trons are bigger and more powerful, so I prefer they have a broader surface, they cover more area. So I prefer those. And in the field, the LEDs I said I use are these Ulanzi lights. Also, Godox makes good ones for the field.
Thank you very much. Another question from Jan, different Jan. What do you pack them in to take them home when you pick up?
Let me actually get you a simple example. I have a number of little boxes. Most of the ones I take are tackle boxes, fishing tackle boxes, but here's a simple example, just a little box, little plastic box. I have a little bit of tissue paper there's a piece of wood with slime molds on it, and I've gently placed it inside the tissue paper. Usually I'll put 2 pieces of tissue paper here. In this case, there's a very small one that's angled here. It's a bit of some redwood needles that have some criterium on them, and I've angled it. So it's a good question because they're very tender. If you touch them, they might fall off. They're very almost brittle. So I take a fishing tackle box and I do something so that I can, if it's on a little tiny branch, I try to wedge it on diagonal corners of the tackle box so it doesn't move. So anything that you can do, or hold it with paper or support it with moss, anything you can do so it doesn't get jostled as you're driving from the woods back home.
Much. Another question from Vathani. Do Mixos die out during midwinter?
Let's talk about my winter. So I'm not sure how your winter is different. In my winter, which is the same months, I mean, it's typically December through February. In my winter, that's when we get all of our rains. We have no rain, almost no rain, typically from April through October, November, sometimes even December. So they don't, if we have extended dry spells in the winter, yes. And our winters have been very strange lately, but most of the time for their life cycle, which will be, as I said, typically 2 days to 2 weeks, they'll stay fresh. But then even if there's rain, they'll sporulate and they're ready to start a different life cycle. But as long as there's sufficient rain, we keep having mixos.
Question from Louisa. How do you identify both the fungi and the mixo?
I'm not very good at mushroom identification. I only know the basic ones. I really spend my time learning about mixos, and I'll get there for a minute. But I do have a number of mushroom identification books. But if you want to learn about mushrooms and how to identify them, I would suggest two things. One is that every county where I live, every state, or every area where you live, there will be a local mushroom club, mycological society. And all of the mycological societies have forays where they go to the woods and they help people find and identify mushrooms. That's one very good way. I will say that most of those are focused, no pun intended, on edible mushrooms, which is less of interest to me. I love to eat mushrooms, but I love to photograph them more. So, but you can always find people in those clubs who know their mushrooms, not just the edible ones. And the other source is various groups online. Facebook has a huge number of groups of mushroom ID. And for me, there's a California mushroom ID group. I will post photos on there, and I'll usually get an answer within an hour or two at most. And lastly, I also use iNaturalist, I mentioned before, where I can post my photos, put what I think is an ID on there, and then others can go through and add IDs. In California, we have people who will very actively ID mushrooms on Facebook. For slime molds, I'm sorry to say that there really isn't a good book for IDing slime molds. Well, for one thing, maybe I don't know, maybe a quarter of the slime molds can be identified from photos alone, but for most of them, you have to do microscopy. You have to look at the spores and other structures, the characteristics of them, the shape, the size, and the marcations on them. So there are books that will show you that, but they're out of print and very expensive. So there's a gap right now. There's not a good field book. There is one in the UK by Bruce Ing, I-N-G, which identifies most of the common mushrooms in the UK. I should add that one. I can't remember its name, but it's Bruce Ing, I-N-G. But really, not again, Facebook. There's a terrific group on Facebook called Slime Mold Identification and Appreciation. And people will post photos of slime mold they found there. And there are world experts who regularly go through the posts on that and will help you identify your slime molds.
Thank you. Right, it's 5:20 now over here. We've still got about a dozen questions to go. You happy to carry on?
I have maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll crack on. Question from Susan. You mentioned how one slime mold changed over time. Do you know why they changed color?
No. Yeah, I don't know why they change color. I don't know why they have iridescence.
Okay. Mark's question you've already answered, which is recommending a guidebook for fungi and mycene. Question from Louisa. Are your pictures used for report and other scientific outreach?
Yes, I have published pictures just for people to admire them, articles on slime molds, but I've also worked with a few researchers to do photos for them that are used in their scientific papers.
Okay, thank you very much. Question from Martin. Do you use a silent shutter on a Sony camera when you're shooting?
Most of the time, yes. It's funny because I just noticed the other day that somehow it's not on silent, so I have to go back to silent, but most of the time, yes.
Question from Surab. During the purchase of an adapter for a microscope objective lens, which parameters are needed?
What was that word?
During the purchase of an adapter for a microscope.
Adapter.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think that's it. I think that's what he means. During the purchase of an adapter for microscope objective lenses, which parameters are needed?
You need to know the thread on the back of the objective, which is readily available where you buy it. And you need to know the thread on whatever tube lens you're using. So there's a Ukrainian company or Russian, I can't remember which, called RAF Camera. And they make extremely good adapters. You can find them either, I think, on their website or on eBay. But you can also find some of these adapters, maybe even on Amazon these days, but certainly eBay. But basically, you just need to know the filter threads of the objective and what it's being attached to.
Okay. Question from Anthony. He says, have you tried using a Helicon remote for use with cameras that have autofocus macro lenses, but not with stacking built into the cameras?
No, I don't use it. A Helicon remote is where you can attach your computer or possibly your iPad or phone and use that to do the stacking, take the photos and then do the stacking. That's just not the way, not my preferred way to do it. So I haven't tried it.
Question from Chris. I sometimes find that the limitations of the camera screen, particularly in an awkward position, limit how well I can see how I'm setting my stack up. Do you ever use OI Share to work with an iPad or similar to get a bigger or better view?
I haven't done it yet, but I will do it soon. I'm actually starting to set that up. I do all of my microscope and LAURA stacking in the horizontal mode, but there are certain subjects that are much more easily photographed vertically stacking. So I bought a device to do vertical stacking, and then I can't see the top of the camera to see the screen. So I will be using, I've already got it set up, OI Share with my laptop. So I can do that for both the LAURA and for microscope objectives.
Okay. Another question from Saruba. Do you think the combination of high quality macro lens and a comparatively cheaper element like the Raynox DCR 250 gives the best result?
Well, best is best for what? Okay. So I recommend the Raynox if you want to start to go beyond 1:1 macro. It is really a sharp lens. It is amazingly sharp. It's inexpensive. You could call it cheap, only in terms of price, but it's not cheap in terms of build, and it really gives quality photos. So it's best for that budget. If you have a lot of money, then Mitutoyo also makes a range of objectives, including 1x and 2x, but they're very expensive. So I think best to get started is the Raynox.
Got 3 questions left, so we're cracking on. Question from Sarah. Says, where did you find the hollow tube that you used in the past, and why did you change?
Where did I find the hollow tube? I think I bought it. There's a Chinese company called Macro, WEMACRO, and they make rails. Actually, the vertical rail I have, I bought from them. So I think I got the tube from them. There's a term called flocking, which is where you put something to absorb the light on the inside of the tube. And I think I was having a problem with the flocking on the macro, and the photos weren't quite as sharp as I thought they could be. And then my friend said, I'm not using this Nikon F4 lens, which is a terrific lens. And I started using that, and it was, I did think the quality was better. But I think that just if you're going to buy tubes, just make sure that they have flocking, high quality flocking on the inside.
Okay, that's good advice. Thank you. Question from Lachlan. I have a Sony A7R5 and a 90mm macro lens. What would you recommend to get the next level of magnification, say 2 times or 4 times? Would you recommend the Leica?
Well, again, a simple way to try is just to add the Raynox 250. Then you'll get 2.5 times. It's inexpensive, and you can use the automated features of the focus stacking in your camera. If you get the LAURA, that's a manual focus lens, so you can't use the camera's automatic stacking feature. So to try your hand at higher magnification, I would suggest the Raynox. The next step for sure is the LAURA, because that goes from 2.5 to 5x, but it also, for most people, is going to require getting a focus rail. So it's gets a lot more complicated and more gear. So I really do suggest people start with the Raynox.
Brilliant, thank you. We've hit the last question now from Kevin. Have you got into lichen photography at all, as these vary so much depending on moisture level?
Yes, I love lichens. Of course, I see them all the time. I thought I would start to learn a little bit about lichens. I went to my local library and I bought the book of California lichens, which was this thick and had an enormous number of species. And I said, too much. There's already too many things I'm trying to do. So occasionally I take photos of lichen because they're beautiful, and they are, in fact, in part fungi. There's a cup fungus in most lichens. So, but there's only so many hours in the day.
That's great. Well, thank you, Alison. Well, that was the last question for today. So, Alison, thanks again. Brilliant presentation, absolutely fascinating. So many thanks for So now, digital imaging puts on very many. Oh, one thing I've mentioned, what's come on the screen now is more information about Alison. This will come out in the email afterwards, and it'll be on the recording. So don't rush away to get a pen. It will be available to you later on. So back to the adverts now for our next presentation. Digital imaging puts on very many online events, as you probably know if you're a regular viewer. We are currently working on the program for 2024. Now, if you're not already a member, you will find that even though the fee for non-members is low, if you are an RPS member, you will probably save money by joining Digital Imaging Group as a digital-only member. I think it's £9 or something for you at the moment. I can't remember, but it's certainly a good deal. So between now and the end of the year, we've got just one more webinar to go. We are putting on a second viewing of the Glyn Dewis meeting from we had on November the 18th. Glyn will be returning to answer your questions live. We are running this second talk to give members in different time zones the opportunity to join us, but of course you're welcome to return for a second viewing if you wish. It will be a recording of the first viewing, but say Glyn will be back to answer live, fresh new questions. So well worth coming along. That will be, as on the advert there, Saturday, 2nd of December, which is next Saturday at 10 a.m. GMT. Or 10 o'clock GMT. So if you want to come and see that, that's a good place to be. So yeah, as I say, if you want to see it again, make sure you book a ticket for it. You can't just use your old link or the link that might have been floating on before. You need to book a ticket, then you can watch it on next Saturday. Well, that's about it for today, folks. So in the meantime, enjoy your photography. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.